How you doing, guys? We swinging with some Ernie Henry right now. Ernie's a bad kid. Today we're talking Riverside. We're going to look at 12 artists with an asterisk that are rare on the Riverside label. The ones that kind of slip through the cracks. And with Prestige and with Riverside, what OJC decided to reissue in the 80s when Fantasy owned all of it has a big impact on the awareness of the modern collector of these records. And the stuff that was omitted by Fantasy for that OJC stuff, it all becomes really rare, and it leaves a lot of them to have only original pressings out there to even be found. Riverside's probably the third greatest label in the jazz canon, behind Blue Note. And what's interesting as we go further in this little series, the Blue Note, it was hard to pick out 12 artists that people weren't going to be familiar with. And I feel like the more experienced jazz heads, there was only a couple guys on each one of their listens. Like, oh, I only knew, there was only 2 guys there I didn't know. There's only a couple guys here I didn't know. Even most of the jazz heads do all those guys on that Blue Note rarity album list. With Prestige, I think there's a few more artists there that are so obscure that even pretty advanced jazz fans don't know. But when we get to Riverside, it's honestly, there's a ton of stuff that's obscure. A ton. And Ernie Henry's not too obscure. He plays with enough of the giants of his age, and he did get reissued on OJC some, so there is some knowledge of Ernie Henry, but he's still a fairly in between the cracks guy. Born in September 1926, great sax player. He plays with Fats Navarro in the late 40s, Tad Dameron. He plays with Charlie Ventura, who's a great sax player himself. He also plays with Max and Dizzy in like 1949. 50 to 52, he's playing with Illinois Jacquette. He plays with Monk on Brilliant Corners in 1956, Ernie Henry does. And that's when he is on the Riverside label at that point. He also records some with Mingus, with Kenny Dorham, Wynton Kelly, Wilbur Ware, Arthur Taylor, Philly Joe Jones. He actually worked with Dizzy again, 56 to 57. And then 57, sadly, he ODs on heroin. He's only 31 years old. But the anxiety and the difficult nature of being black in America in 1957, it's exhausting. It's a heavy toll, you know, and the fear and the tension that we feel when our children are in the line of duty off in the service, or if one of your kids is a cop, or when the virus is kind of, you know, heavy in the news, when there's fear in people's hearts, the Cold War, there's an anxiety and a tension that comes with that on a daily basis that's exhausting. And I don't think as many jazz players took drugs to be inspired, I got some allergies today, as they did to help deal with the tension and stress of daily life as a black male in America. It's exhausting. And it ripples through the black community, not just the jazz circles. You know, it wasn't going to be in a jazz circle to get access to heroin. It was everywhere in the streets of the ghetto, and it wasn't being brought in by Joe Blow pimp on the corner. It was coming from some much higher up places. When you're shipping container ships with drugs, dropping them in neighborhoods, that's being done by an upper level economics. And it's being done with intent to destroy a neighborhood and a community that we don't want elevating. We need to keep them suppressed. We need to have a bottom rung in capitalism for all the middle rungs to feel justified with their lower lot in life. I might be poor, but look at them. And so the tension has to exist between the injustice of what's happening to them that some of us in the lower and upper middle classes will feel, versus the indignation of why are they such criminals attempting to steal what I have. Meanwhile, the upper 1% never has to deal with any of us. They just keep us so misinformed. Ernie Henry is a great player, a beautiful tone, plays ballads with the best of them, plays a good driving hard bop. He was a guy that you could tell had some sorrow on his chest. He had some blues that he wanted to get off. And he definitely gets the blues off on almost every one of his recordings. And sadly, he was taken from us very early. I also got a few things on my hands for putting up a chain link fence yesterday. A construction worker, I'm not. But this is Ernie Henry's debut on Riverside, number 222. And for those who don't remember, the Riverside Modern Jazz series starts at 200 with Thelonious Monk. And interspersed in that first 40 records is a handful of jazz classics, and there's also a lot of obscure stuff. A lot of what they're issuing is some Dixieland and some earlier 10-inch material, and Blue Note made the distinction of taking some of their 10-inch stuff that was more Dixieland and giving it its own separate 12-inch sequence. I think it was the 5000 series for Blue Note. Riverside just decides that, you know what, some of that 1000 10-inch stuff, we're just going to issue it in the 200 series. And then they eventually do give a special designation to some of their older 100 series stuff that comes out on the 12-inch LP. But they do issue some stuff in the 200 sequence that Blue Note would have put somewhere else. So that's part of the issue here. But he does this great record with Kenny Dorham, number 255, probably 1958. Riverside has minimal recordings in 55 on the 12-inch LP. Probably only, I think, between 55 and 56, there's like 25 albums. And then 57, the doors really swing open. 58, they become a giant. This is the great Ernie Henry Quartet with Wynton Kelly, Wilbur Ware, and Philly Joe Jones. And then this is the last chorus, which I think comes out after he dies, with Lee Morgan, Benny Golson, Kenny Dorham, and Thelonious Monk. And I think this is from several different recording sessions. But Ernie Henry is a guy worth seeking out. He's a guy that should be in collections, and his obscurity is probably aided by his early departure, sadly enough. But again, I can't judge a man for trying to survive. It's an exhausting life at times. Number 11 in my countdown of obscure early Riverside artists. And Riverside as an entity is gone by 1963. So there's a lot of late Riverside stuff. And Riverside gets bought by various entities, and there is stuff coming out with the Riverside name on it, but there's no more Riverside recording sessions after 62. I believe Bill Grauer passes suddenly, and Keep New stays in the business for years. But he's once Bill Grauer goes, Riverside kind of goes with him. Next guy I want to talk about is Don Elliott, and I'm actually a big Don Elliott fan. And he's going to be familiar to some of you guys, but he's also going to be not known to a lot of people. He has a number of recordings here on Riverside. He shows up as Simon, helping out other artists as well. This is the great Counterpoint for 6 Valves with Rusty Diedrich. And this is the voice of Marty Bell featuring Don Elliott. And this record, I'm somewhat disappointed with it because Marty Bell sings like a white Anglican minister. Just persimmons. And he just kind of sounds uptight and prim and proper and doesn't have a lot of blues to him whatsoever. But Elliott's all the same a fantastic player. And Elliott's got an interesting background. He was born in October 1926. He was nicknamed the Human Instrument. He was born in New Jersey. He played the trumpet. He played the vibraphone really well. He was a great vocalist singer. He played the trombone. He played the flugelhorn. He could play almost anything he really sat down and gave a shot at. He has over 60 LPs, including 3 outstanding records on Bethlehem that you got to get. His voice, one where he sings on Bethlehem's outstanding. The mellophone record on Bethlehem's outstanding. He also has a trumpet record on Bethlehem that's great. He does some stuff for ABC. He does the Jamaica Calypso record, which is one of the great Jamaica Calypso jazz records that's in existence. He's one of the guys, he's considered the guy who pioneers multi-track recording. He gets into film scores, does a number of film scores. He does some Broadway production arranging and music for that. And then in the 70s, in the late 60s, he's a longtime associate of Quincy Jones. And he does a lot of Quincy Jones famous soundtracks, sings on them, stuff like The Pawnbroker, Heat of the Night. He's working with Quincy for quite a long time. over 60 LPs, and he also makes over 5,000 radio jingle commercials. And so again, your trajectory as a white musician is somewhat different than the Ernie Henrys of the world. You can diversify your portfolio rather successfully when you're a white multi-instrumentalist. When you're Ernie Henry with all the talent in the world, but you a brother, you just got to make it through today, man. And it's truly, it's galling. Again, there's some great Riverside 10-inch stuff. I'm not going to show you a ton of it here, but they did delve pretty deep into 10 inches. The next guy I want to show you has 4 albums in the early 200 sequence. He follows a trajectory somewhat of Don Elliott in terms of he ends up in Hollywood and has a rather large career there. But Mundell Lowe was born in April 1922. He's son of a Baptist minister from Mississippi. He picks up guitar at the age of 8. He would often run away to go play in bands, and his dad would find him and bring him home and warn him about the dangers of whiskey. Being my preacher's kid myself, I kind of know the temptation to run away and be in a band and how that feels. I'm very akin to that. In 16, he ends up in Nashville playing for the Grand Ole Opry. World War II happens. He's asked to serve for a while. In basic training, he meets John Hammond, the great civil rights activist and discoverer of so much great black talent in the South. He would just scour the South looking for great musicians. He would hear the legends of great musicians and spend years, months on the road trying to find these guys and getting them into studios so that Columbia and other various labels could record them. He became a dear friend of John Hammond's, and they played together in basic training. He calls him after the Army for work, and he ends up getting a job with Ray McKinley, then eventually Benny Goodman. In 1950, he gets a job at NBC Studios, and he's on a lot of TV programs and jingles. And then during this time, he's also working off and on again as a jazz musician, sometimes taking 6-month leaves of absence. He works with the Dorsey brothers. He works with Bill Evans. In fact, it was Mundell Lowe that recommended Bill Evans to Orrin Keep News at Riverside Records. So there's a connection there between Mundell Lowe and Bill Evans. He works with Billie Holiday, Red Norvo, Charlie Mingus, Charlie Parker, Lester Young. So Mundell Lowe is playing guitar on a lot of important records in the 50s. In the 60s, he decides to move out west because he wants to work more in the film industry. He ends up working with Carmen McRae and Sarah Vaughan on the West Coast in the 60s. A long career, a guy that stuck around and again is responsible for a lot of TV and film. The great Mundell Lowe. This is number 208, so it's the 8th record issued on Riverside. And it's just beautiful stuff. Elegant, gorgeous. He's got 4 records, as I mentioned. This is 204, so that's even earlier, with Dick Hyman, Trigger Alpert, and Ed Shaughnessy. This one is 219, and this is with the new music of Alec Wilder, Mundell Lowe and his orchestra. And he's playing some pretty big arrangements here with a pretty large ensemble, but it's gorgeous. And then A Grand Night for Swingin', Mundell Lowe, number 238 on the Riverside 200 series. And by 238, Riverside's about to turn a corner. But I'm going to give you a little sample of this one too. This one's a little more swinging. It's got Billy Taylor, Gene Quill, Les Grenage, Ed Thigpen, recorded in 1957. And so he's as comfortable doing chamber music as he is swinging in the jazziest of contexts, as he is making a jingle for Sprite. And again, if you're a white jazz musician, your trajectory, especially as jazz starts to dwindle in its popularity, there's no question that your trajectory and opportunity is different. And there's no question a lot of blacks ended up in Hollywood, but not nearly to the same degree. So I'm counting down now. We're on to number 9, and that leads us to a guy who's a vibraphone player by the name of Dave Pike. Pike's a beautiful player. He has an interesting career again. He's born in March of '38. He plays vibes and the marimba. He also plays with Bill Evans and Herbie Mann in the 50s and 60s. He plays with some Kenny Clark and some Paul Bly, actually. And then in the 50s and 60s, he makes a number of records for this one for Riverside, which is his first. Does a couple for New Jazz and a Swingville for New Jazz, Riverside Prestige, sorry. So he's got like 3 records there. And where am I at here? Then he works for Decca and Atlantic, and he makes a record for Epic that's also really good. But when he's working for Atlantic, he makes this record that's pretty fun, cool copy, cool cover, I mean, interesting to find. And I just wanted to show you that because that record can go for pretty good bucks. Shortly after that, though, he makes a record called The Doors of Perception, and Lee Condence, Don Friedman, a couple guys I really like. Chuck Israel's on that record. It's on the Vortex label, a subsidiary of Atlantic. And that Doors of Perception record has some real edges to it, some almost psychedelic avant-garde at times. So Pike was a guy that really could push the envelopes and do some interesting production and arrangement. In the 60s, at some point, he does go to Europe, and he works over there in Belgium and Germany for a long time, from my understanding. And as we start going forward here, there's going to be less and less information on these artists. So I'm going to be able to give you less and less of a biography. We talked about this record recently. I mentioned it in the 1956 episode, the year that I feel like jazz really embraced the LP and starts changing how it was done, recorded, and played. 56 was a pretty landmark year, but this is a great record. Matthew Gee is a great trombone player. He actually starts out on the baritone and the trumpet and then switches to the trombone. He's a Houston native, went to New York in the late 50s. He played with Coleman Hawkins briefly in the 40s, got signed up for the Army, part of World War II. He plays with Dizzy Gillespie from 44 to 49. Dizzy seems to be a great talent scout. You don't really hear of him in that context per se, but it's amazing how many young cats in the 50s and 60s spent time under Dizzy's tutelage. Dizzy's really a great leader in the music, not just for his innovation and his virtuosity, but Dizzy's also a great teacher and a spreader of the gospel. And he's teaching these guys how this game is to be played. Matthew Gee, I can't read what that says, plays with Gene Ammons. He plays with Sonny Stitt and joins Basie briefly. Illinois Jacquette from 52 to 54. Lou Donaldson, he plays with briefly in 54. Sarah Vaughan in 56. 59 to 63, he's actually playing with Duke Ellington's orchestra off and on. In the 60s, he works with Paul Kinechet, Johnny Griffin, and Sonny Stitt. And this was his one record as an LP leader that comes out in the 56 on Riverside, number 221. And you can tell it's a pretty modern, swinging sound here. And this is kind of the dawning, right around here, where Monk's already doing stuff. Evans just showed up. Gee and Henry are doing their albums. So you really are starting to see the modernization of the Riverside 200 series at this point. Another guy who I'm a big fan of and doesn't get spoken about much, I've seen him posted some in some of the jazz groups, is the fantastic pianist Evans Bradshaw. It's supposed to reach 96 here today. It feels like it's already 90 in this room right now. It's hot. But look up for Evans Bradshaw, number 263, and the Pieces of 88, Evans Bradshaw Trio, number 296. So these both come a little later in the 200 sequence and are both outstanding records. He was born in 1933 in Memphis. By the age of 12, he's playing in his father's group. In 1958, he moves to New York. He catches the interest of Orrin Keep News, and they record these two fantastic records. He has an eye condition where his sight's very limited. It's not limiting his ability to sound like Art Tatum. It's not limiting his ability to emote at lightning fast tempo. George Joyner and Philly Joe Jones on the bass and the drums. Bradshaw's a beast. He really is. He just flies through the arpeggios and has a real comfort. There's a bit of barrelhouse boogie woogie in there at times. Sadly, these two records are all the recording he does. And he never records again after these two records. And Wikipedia didn't tell me why, but he disappears off the scene. And these records should be collected more and looked for by people because they are outstanding. I actually listened to those two Evans Bradshaw records a pretty great deal. Now, a guy that's a great piano player and composer was a guy by the name of John Benson Brooks. 1917 he was born. He's a pianist, composer, and arranger. And from my understanding, Cannonball Adderley brought him to the attention of Keep News and convinces him to record this session, which I think initially comes out on a different label, maybe possibly, but it's kind of co-credited to Cannonball Adderley here for sure. His name's in the big print with Art Farmer. But this is the composition by John Benson Brooks that he has bring to life by Farmer, Adderley, Barry Galbraith, Milt Hinton, John Benson Brooks on the piano. And it's an interesting composition. It's got some real edges to it. If you're a fan of Mingus, if you're a fan of just organized but still soulful, this is a great record. And it's very interesting to listen. It kind of weaves and morphs its way to some pretty interesting changes. And it's a guy not talked about a whole lot. Now, a guy I'm a big fan of is a guy by the name of James Clay. And now we're into the 300s. This is 327, and this is 349. Great tenor, Texas player. He plays on the edges of hard bop, but he also plays firmly in a very modern sense. Beautiful. I do know most heavy collectors will have some James Clay. Here he's playing with David Fathead Newman. This one's got Nat Adderley, Victor Feldman, the great Gene Harris from the Three Sounds, Sam Jones, and Louis Hayes. And again, he was born in Texas, 1935 in Dallas. He went to school with Booker Ervin. They actually played together down there in Dallas. In 57, he moves to California. Played with Red Mitchell. He's on his contemporary release. He might be on his Bethlehem release as well. He also plays with Don Cherry, Hank Crawford. He plays a little bit with Wes Montgomery, moving west. A guy by the name of Frank Morgan. Lorraine Geller, Herb Geller's wife. Great piano player. The great piano player Lawrence Marble. He plays with him out west. And then he goes into obscurity after 57, 58. And he doesn't really resurface until the late 80s and 90s, where he has a resurgence before his death. And he actually has a lot of people out there kind of following him who discover him at that point. And that's one of the great things about jazz fans, is if they just rediscover you even later in life. It's not like pop music where pops move so far away from what you're doing that we can't really go out there and attach our wagon to it the same way. In jazz, the guy was a great player in the 50s. If he kept playing at all, he's going to still be a great player in the 80s, and we'll still have a story to tell us. Now, we're starting to get into more obscure stuff now. This is a record by the Jazz 5 called the Hooter. And it can be a pretty tough record to come by, to be honest. I looked on Wikipedia, didn't find a thing. I do know they're a group from London, England, mostly white cats by the look of it. Victor Ashe, Harry Klein, Brian D, Malcolm Cecil, and Bill Aiden. And apparently there's another drummer that plays on a couple tracks. This is recorded in London in 1960. Upon My Soul, there it is, the Hooter. It's kind of a soul jazz, pretty light swinging. Again, I don't know too much about it. I've listened to it numerous times and enjoyed it. It's a weird album cover. Some good playing. That's some baritone sax there. So it's got baritone and tenor with piano, bass, and drums. That's an interesting lineup to have tenor and baritone sax together, and no brass, no trumpets, no sax. I mean, no trumpets or whatever. So this leads us to number 3. A great piano player from the DC area. A guy by the name of Dick Morgan. And once again, Wikipedia had nothing to tell me about Dick Morgan. I do know he's from DC. I'm pretty sure he actually ended up doing some teaching. He makes 3 records for Riverside, and these are in the 300 sequence. So for as late as these are in the Riverside discography, he's still fairly obscure, even though at this point he's surrounded by stars and legends of the music on all the other Riverside releases at this point. These are all great records. He's got a bit of Ellington's class. He's got a great swing to him. A bit of the Gene Harris 3 Sounds vibe. I love these Dick Morgan records. They're definitely to be looked for. And I said, like, they're tough to find, and Wikipedia had nothing to tell me about Dick Morgan, so I can't tell you a whole lot more than that. Like I said, he was born in 1929 in Virginia, and I'm not sure how many releases he even has after these, if there are any. So that wraps up what I got to tell you about Dick Morgan. Aside from that, I love him. He's great. And then it's a little confusing, but there's a guy by the name of Dick Johnson, which is a rather unfortunate name if you're into penis jokes. Dick Johnson? You wouldn't have survived long in my high school with that name. Although I did know a Harry Dick, and that was a real kid's name. But Dick Johnson was a clarinetist, played at Artie Shaw's group for a long time, and actually he led Artie Shaw's group throughout the 80s and 90s, long after Artie Shaw passed. The Artie Shaw Orchestra kept playing, and I'm sure they were playing dance halls in Vegas and retirement communities forever. Artie Shaw had a pretty big following in the swing era. Next to Glenn Miller, he was one of the biggest guys out there, and Benny Goodman, of course. But Dick Johnson, again, a great clarinetist. He's from Massachusetts area. He played with Tommy Dorsey. He actually worked with Sinatra and I thought I wrote down the name of the song. He plays with Tony Bennett as well and Dizzy Gillespie. Again, another Gillespie connection. Just a great virtuoso with Dave McKenna, Wilbur Ware, and Philly Joe Jones. You can hear the cat can play. He's got a record on Emercy too around this time. And that's number 2 on my list, Dick Johnson. And so now that leads us to number 1. And this is the asterisk I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. There's so many rare artists early in the Riverside discography that I'm just going to show you right now a number of artists. I'm not going to dive into them at all. We're just going to talk real quick about, I do want to play a little bit of this one. Elmer Snowden, Harlem Banjo. Not an instrument you think of in the jazz world whatsoever. Great record. With Les Spann on the guitar, if I remember. Cliff Jackson, actually. I thought Les Spann was on this. No, Tommy Bryant, Jimmy Crawford, 1960. And again, it shows you Keep News and Grauer were interested in having interesting stuff. Some of the stuff I'm about to show you, I think at Blue Note and Prestige wouldn't have come out in the modern series. They would have put it in a different series. This fantastic Gene Mail, Dixieland Rhythm Kings, great record, tough to come by. Carl Halen's Gin Bottle 7, number 261. Hooray for Bix, Marty Groves, number 268. The Red Onion Jazz Band, Gene Mail's Dixieland Rhythm Kings again, one of my favorite album covers. Another one I want to show you here, if I recall he's Belgian, is Jean Thielman. A fantastic harmonica player. And he's got Pepper Adams and Kenny Drew, Wilbur Ware and Art Taylor. Forget about it. It's so strolling down the River Seine or the marketplace in Antwerp or a day trip into Luxembourg. We're going to travel down the Rhine and drink white wines, the softest of white wines. We chilled in the glass sweating. It's going to be a good day. But Toots Thielman's a fantastic player. It's not something you hear very often. What's cool about this record is hearing Pepper Adams on a baritone saxophone playing next to a harmonica. They actually really dovetail nicely together. It's a record that's not that tough to find in a relative sense, and it's worth seeking out. I really love it. It's cool. Gin Bottle Carl Halen record. Trigger Alpert and his All-Stars with Marty Page, Dick Hyman, Tony Scott, Joe Wilder, Al Cohn, and Zoot Sims. Bob Corman Quartet with Don Elliott, we talked about earlier. Sharky Banana with Paul Barberin, another great New Orleans-style Dixie player. Conrad Janis, another Dixieland trombone player. 215, 213, one of the toughest ones for me to find was this 12-inch LP. At the time I was looking for it, Discogs didn't even have the 12-inch version. There's a 10-inch version of this as well. Ralph Sutton, the great piano player, 212. Wild Bill Davison, the great trumpet player from the swing era and the Dixieland. Gene Mail, Hi-Fi. Tony Parenti, Ragtime. And then Joe Sutton and Joe Sullivan. There's two different guys. And another piano player. This is number 202. So there's a lot of pretty obscure titles early in the Riverside discography. And again, part of what this shows you is just how insane the Blue Note discography is. For release after release after release to be iconic. And the deeper I dug into all these other labels, for reference sake, the more esteem I put the Blue Note discography in. There's no other label where the iconic nature of all their releases, nearly 500, it's just unprecedented. It's not to diminish what Riverside does, even though there's more obscure titles. Most of it's fantastic music and absolutely worth purchasing and looking for. And to me, it's actually fun sometimes buying stuff that nobody else knows or has, and then be able to point, it's Riverside, see, you should know this. But again, a lot of it's just so obscure. It's so tough to come by. And so many of these Riverside Prestige Blue Note records are still stuck either on the East Coast in people's basements, or they got shipped off to Japan in the 90s when the Japanese decided that all American black music was worth having in ubiquitous volumes. You know, Michael Jackson's records, they stacked them up to the ceiling and took them out of the country. Dang sliver I got. But Riverside's absolutely an outstanding label, and I wouldn't consider any of these records missteps. They were just a transition period from the Dixie revival thing that was kind of starting to happen, and the swing era, which was winding down, and they were trying to get some of their 10-inch stuff onto the LP, and they just kind of lumped it into the modern sequence. And certainly by 240, it changes dramatically and it becomes a very solid discography. But there's still stuff in there that it's going to be a lot more obscure to people than the Blue Note stuff or even the Prestige stuff. That being said, Riverside's royalty. So let me know if you like these. I could do a few more on some of the other labels, but like I said, if I got to the Argo label, I could show you the 12 records everybody knows, and then the 200 that very few will know. There's a lot of obscure stuff on some of these labels. Y'all be safe, have a great day. Appreciate you all. Peace.